oh my goodness, who told me that I'd be reading a whole encyclopedia? At the very beginning up until the very end, I did not enjoy this. I loved this book down bad. 5 stars. Hello, welcome to my reading wrapped of 2024. This year I managed to read 57 books and my reading goal was to read 30 books, so I definitely smashed it out of the park unexpectedly. Bear in mind, previous years, I think the most I'd read one of the years during the pandemic was like 6 books, so this is the first year in a long time that I've really gotten into reading and read so many books. And another note to say is majority of the books that I've read this year have been on my Kindle, so they haven't been physical books, or I've listened to them as an audiobook. So I've also underconsumed when it comes to buying physical books, and I have a rule of thumb at the moment where I will only buy books that I've read which have been like 5-star reads, or books that have been on my TBR for a really long time, and if they're a good price then I'll pick it up. That aside, let's jump straight into all the books that I read in 2024. 57 books in total, and I'm going to let you know my thoughts on each of the books. So my first book of the year that I ended up reading was A Court of Wings and Ruin. This is part of Sarah J Maas's series, A Court of Thorn and Roses, and do you know what? Credit to that series. I really have to give credit where credit is due, because this was the book series that reignited my love for reading and really picked up my fantasy interest. Before this, I wasn't much of a fantasy reader. I didn't really care for it, and then I started reading this series, and slowly but surely I just kept picking up another fantasy novel, another fantasy novel, and another one, and now I am a fantasy girly. I love it. It's my favourite genre to read, and it all started because of her book. I rated this book 5 stars. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It is part of the series, so you definitely have to read the first 2 books in it, but once you get to the 3rd book, it just picks up so much. You really get to understand our characters even further. The character development is really lovely and refreshing, and we have a lot more action scenes towards the end, so I did like the build up within this book. Because like I said, I was on a bit of like a roll when it came to romantasy books, I then read Bomb, Blood and Ash, and I regretted it. I had a hard time reading this book. I rated it 2 stars. I just couldn't get into it with the plot. I didn't like the characters, and I just struggled to read it. So as a palate cleanser, I then jumped to reading an Emily Henry book. So Happy Place was I believe it was my first book that I've read by Emily Henry, and it was such a good introduction to her books. Even up until now, I'd say Emily Henry is one of my top 10 authors of all time that I really enjoy reading her work. So Happy Place follows the story of Win and Harriet, who are seemingly the dream couple to their friend groups and to the people that they know in real life, but they've just gone through a breakup which they've not told anybody. So when their annual summer trip comes up with their group of friends, they must fake still being together in order to not arouse suspicion from their friends. So can they keep it low-key by showing to their friends that they're not together? One thing that I found interesting about Emily Henry is each of the characters goes through a transformation. They have a character flaw. So for this one, if I remember correctly, Harriet is quite a people pleaser, and so she goes on a journey of trying to unlearn this and just realise how detrimental it has been to her relationships and for herself. So she just goes on a journey on solving this. So yeah, I really enjoyed reading this book and rated it quite highly too. The next book that I read after that was Heart of Night and Fire, and it's an Eloisa Lovers romantasy story. It has some good world building, but I just couldn't get into it. I couldn't get into the characters, and unfortunately for me, I felt the story fell flat towards the end. I ended up rating it 2 stars out of 5, and I think there is a sequel to this book, but I personally will not be reading it myself. We had a bit of a self-help moment in January, and I started to read The Mountain Is You by Brianna Weist. I love this book. I listened to it as an audiobook, and it was the perfect soundtrack to my walks. It was the perfect thing to listen to as you start a new year, because you realise that some of the self-sabotaging habits that we have is what's stopping us from living our dream lives. What she's written in this book I found was not revolutionary. However, Brianna has a way of writing things in a way that makes you think, oh, I didn't think of it that way, or oh, I needed someone else to explain what I already knew. So this was that book for me. So this is a perfect book if you are starting a new year and you want to just achieve certain things in your life, but you realise that there's always some sort of little blocker, and that blocker happens to be you. This is how you stop yourself from self-sabotaging and getting in the way of achieving what it is that you want to do. Yeah, really enjoyed that one. I believe I rated it 4 out of 5 stars. After this, I went back to my fantasy roots and read Poppy War by Armentrout. This is my first book by her. She's a phenomenal writer. She researches her world and plots and just builds such interesting characters, and this was my introduction to her writing and to her work. The Poppy Wall is a dense military historical fantasy novel. That's one thing that I did not do my research about when I went into reading it. I just read fantasy and I thought, yeah, I can do that. Except this was deeper than I thought it was going to be. Very much deep in military, deep in history. She walks us through military techniques and war situations in vivid graphic detail. That's one thing to prepare yourself for when you are reading this book. You have morally grey main characters who at the beginning you're like, oh my gosh, you know, she's going through tough times. I can see why she hates, you know, the people and wants to get revenge, etc. Then a few things happen, you're like, was that maybe a little too far? Like, very morally grey, but I did think the world building was really good, and I believe this book has some elements based on history, so that's another thing to keep in mind as you're reading this book as well. I rated this 3 stars out of 5. I know other people would rate it much higher. I started Throne of Glass, and to be honest, it's the only book of Throne of Glass in the series that I've read so far, but I read book 1 and rated it 4 stars out of 5. It follows an assassin who is summoned to the castle, and the king wants her to basically defeat 23 killers who win her freedom, and we go on this journey with her as she embarks on this mission. I know this book is one of possibly 8 to 10 books in the series. I've only read book 1, but I think 2025 might be the year that I pick up book 2 and 3 just so I can get along in this series. The next book, Divine Rivals, I was actually disappointed that I didn't enjoy it more. I feel like the premise of this is so fantastic. I'm surprised that I didn't give this a higher rating. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. It follows 2 young rival journalists as they discover they can communicate to each other through a magic system. Like, basically you put a letter through the door, it arrives to this other journalist, and they start their communications back and forth, but they don't realise who the other person is when they start this. It's set on the backdrop of a war that's happening, and so the 2 of them embark on being journalists on the front lines as they try to report what's happening in the war and try not to get killed in the process. So there is 2 books out. I will only read this one because I just couldn't get into it. Another Sarah J Maas book that I read was Crescent City, book 1, House of Earth and Blood. This is a dense book. So I read most of my books, like I said, on a Kindle. So this beautiful device is brilliant for not telling you just how long a book is. And I remember going to the shops when I was reading this book, and I saw the physical copy of it and I thought, oh my goodness, who told me that I'd be reading a whole encyclopedia? The book is like this thick, but when you're in a Kindle and you're swiping along, you don't realise just how big this book is. But anyway, I really enjoyed this. I rated this 5 stars out of 5. It was a book club pick, which I'm so happy that we chose this one to read. So this one is another fantasy novel. It's set in a world where there are werewolves, angels, vampires, I think, if I remember correctly. And our main character, Brianna, has a seemingly perfect life until someone really close to her gets murdered, and she must work with a notorious fallen angel to solve these murders and see what's been happening across the city, whilst also trying not to get killed. It's like a murder mystery set in a fantasy world with a really hot angel. I feel like the pacing of it was perfect for just how much world building is required. It's like I needed it more because that last 100 pages, insane. Right after finishing Crescent City, I jumped into a contemporary fiction novel and read Maame by Jessica George and absolutely loved it. I rated it 5 stars out of 5. It follows Maddie, a young 20-something-year-old living in London. She's Ghanaian descent, and her father has been diagnosed with advanced Parkinson's, and she becomes his main carer. Her mother lives majority of the time in Ghana but flies back to London here and there, so she's literally the main person looking after her father, but she also hates her job. So everywhere Maddie's turning, she feels very dissatisfied with life, and so through a series of events she goes on a journey to discover who she is, her identity, and explore what life as a 20-something can be like, as she does many firsts, from love to moving out, living on her own, and finding a new job. And we go on that journey with her as she rediscovers who Maddie is, her self-identity, outside of being called Maame by her mother, and other people in her family. So I really liked this book because it explored the complicated nature of family, explored what it meant to be the eldest daughter, looking after people, being responsible, whilst also trying to figure out your life for yourself while shouldering all these responsibilities. Next, I read The Serpent and the Wings of Night, which is part of a series. This is book 1. This is based on a fantasy world of humans and vampires, and our main character is the adopted daughter of a vampire king, if I remember correctly. So she decides to step into the world and become her own person by entering these deadly tournament called the Kajari, which is blessed by the goddesses themselves with an incredible prize at the end. So she must battle it out with the other vampire houses who send their own, I guess you could call them recruits, or just people who go to battle it out with her. And she must survive against vampires whilst she is very much a human. So we sort of see how this unfolds, and she learns for herself what the reality is of living in this world, and who does she become at the end when she is forced to do things just for survival. I ended up rating this book 4 stars out of 5. I quite enjoyed it. I think it was the tournament element that made it really fun, because you just sort of see how she handles different situations when she's up against such bad odds. The next book, Powerless by Lauren Roberts, was a 2-star read for me. I did not enjoy this book. From the very beginning up until the very end, I did not enjoy this. I thought the premise of the book is quite good, but I think whilst reading it, what I struggled with the most was its resemblance to a lot of other books that I've read already, and I thought that was a bit of a low point, because what could have been an interesting premise and unique ended up not being so much, because I could sort of guess what was going to happen next because it resembled other books too. Then the next one I read was Ali Hazelwood, Bride. This is my first Ali Hazelwood book, and it ended up being one of 2 that I read this year. I do plan on reading some more next year. This one is another fantasy novel, except it has vampires, werewolves, humans. I wouldn't say they basically coexist, but they do need to form alliances with each other. And so our main character, Misery Lark, her father wants to form an alliance with the werewolves, and so in order to form this alliance, he sets her up to be married to the alpha of the werewolf group. And so through this marriage, they hope to secure peace and alliance with the people, until Misery Lark discovers something's happened to someone she cares about, and she is on a mission to figure out what has happened to her friend whilst getting assistance from her new husband. Love the characters. I love the dynamic between our 2 main characters. And then on to the theme of werewolves, because clearly I enjoyed Bride so much that I looked for another werewolf novel. I read The Fake Mate by Lana Ferguson. Between these 2 doctors who agree to be fake mates, or a marriage of convenience, and so they lie to everybody in their lives to say that they're dating when they're actually not, and the 2 of them end up discovering that they may actually have feelings for each other in the process. I quite enjoyed this. I did give it 3 stars out of 5 in the end. I also read The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. I listened to this as an audiobook. I struggle to rate memoirs purely because it's about a person's life, and I just don't think we should be giving people's lives ratings. But I know I enjoyed listening to Britney Spears talk about her story, and it really felt like the first time she was able to take ownership and full control over piece of art that she has wanted to go out into the world. So you got to hear the stories from her about her experiences, her journey, and the things that she has overcome really in the industry with her family, and all of the things that has been printed about her in the press. She finally got to take ownership and say her story as it is. So I really enjoyed learning about Britney Spears through Britney Spears. I then read Small Worlds by Caleb Azumah Nelson. He is a phenomenal British writer. This is the second book that I've read by him. The first one was Open Water. Main character Stephen. Stephen is guided by his love for music and for dancing, and it becomes the pace in which this book is written about. So Stephen has to explore his relationship with his family, his community, his first love interest as well, and also discover for himself who he is in a world that seemingly wants to put labels on him and restrictions. Small World is an exhilarating, expansive novel about the worlds we build for ourselves, the worlds we live, dance and love within. Next, I read The Death of Vivek Oji. I rated this book 4 stars out of 5 stars. It's beautifully written. It's complicated. It's about Vivek, who, honestly, this is not even a spoiler. This is the first page. He turns up dead at his parents' doorstep, but we have no idea how he died or the events that led up to his death. And so throughout this book, we get to see what Vivek's life was like leading up to their death and what happened afterwards, and the people closest to them as his mother tries to piece together the life of her son, of who she thought he was. So the next book was a book club pick, and I'm really glad it was suggested because I don't think I would have picked this up myself, but after reading this I'm so glad that we did, and it made me open up my mind to reading other genres as well. The book that I'm talking about is The Heiress by Rachel Hawkins. I believe I'd class this more as a drama slash thriller. This book follows Cam, who is the adopted son of Ruby McTavish. She has lived a dramatic life, from being kidnapped as a child to now being a person with a lot of money and several husbands and things that have happened to these partners of hers. We now see what's happened to Cam. He's forced to go back to the family estate to sort of figure things out. There is a bit of a mystery in the storyline because we are not too sure what's happened to Ruby. We don't know what she killed. Did she just die? So I like the pacing of this book. I liked our characters as well. The next one that I read was a fantasy novel, Law of the Wilds. I'll share with you what I wrote down as my review. So, promising plot and characters, but I felt no connection to them. The world building was great and refreshing to read fantasy novels that have POC main characters. It's nice to see yourself in a book, and that's what I really loved about this, is I could see myself in the book. Even just thinking about what to do with your hair in like a fantasy world, I thought that was really interesting to read about. But as I mentioned, I really struggled to have a connection to the world building itself, and that might be within the writing, but I definitely do recommend picking up this book and checking it out for yourself. Like I said, even though I may not have had a high rating experience, it doesn't stop it from being a great book or something that can be enjoyed by other people. One of my favourite romance books that I read was Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. This is my first book that I've read by Abby Jimenez, but not the last to say the least. I love this book from start to finish. This is my notes. Justin has set the bar high for fictional men and loved his patience with Emma as she navigated her past showing up in the present. I couldn't put this book down. I'm pretty sure I read this in 2 days, which just goes to show how much I was absorbed in the story. From Memory's recollection, Justin and Emma are both really unlucky. Every person that they've both dated has gone on to meet the love of their lives after they've broken up, so they both believe they are cursed, and in order to overcome this curse they agree to date each other just for the summer to see if it will cancel out and they can hopefully meet the love of their lives afterwards. So over the course of the summer, the two of them discover each other. They also have to deal with their very complicated family setups and responsibilities that come with them. So we see how they navigate this over the course of the book. I rated this 5 stars out of 5. The next book that I read was The Cruel Prince. I rated this 3 stars out of 5. I think I enjoyed the book in general. Nothing about it, when I'm looking at the title, stands out to me. So it's not like a book that I'm like, oh my gosh, would love to read it again or would recommend it. I think it was just an alright book. So that's all I can say about it. Funny story by Emily Henry. Like I said, I really started to get into Emily Henry. This is my second book that I read of hers, and this was a highly anticipated release. So as soon as it came out, book club pick, we read it and enjoyed it. The book follows Daphne, who is engaged to the love of her life. That is until he realizes that he's done enough with his childhood best friend Petra. So Daphne and Peter break up because Peter decides he wants to be with Petra, and so Daphne now has to find a new place to live and becomes roommates with Petra's ex Miles. So the two of them are going through their heartbreak together, so we get to explore what happens between the two of them as they are roommates, and we see this unfolding. In the spirit of reading more genres, I picked up another memoir and read Spare by Prince Harry. I've always been quite intrigued by the royal family and had an interest in knowing what is it like to be a person of royalty, highly scrutinised, and has a lot of privilege in this world. And Spare was a really good insight into what it'd be like, especially coming from Prince Harry. He speaks about his life literally from childhood, very early memories, all the way up until his life now with his wife, his children, living in America and being more removed from the royal family. He really goes in tons of details about his experiences, conversations that he's had within his family, and also what the setup is like, and you really do get an idea as to what a gilded cage it can be to be in the royal family and how much of it is not in their control. The media has so much ownership over them and it constrains their relationships. So I rated it 4 stars out of 5. The next book that I read was a 5-star read for me. It's part of the Shepherd King duology. It's One Dark Window, and it was my first foray into dark fantasy. I think that's how you can describe that genre. I quite enjoyed it. Very unique magic system, a very unique plot line. It follows our main character who has has what you call the nightmare living in her head. The nightmare gives her powers, strength, and can communicate to her, and she has had this person living in her head since she was a child, and now she must use the nightmare to help discover Providence cards, which will help remove the mist that lives in their area. So this mist is the thing that if you walk into it, most people never return, and it limits people's movements. So finding all the Providence cards will help to lift the curse off of this small town, but it gets complicated when you're relying on a nightmare in your head that you actually can't control. And the question is, who is controlling who? Okay, the next one that I enjoyed a lot, I rated it 4 stars out of 5, is Terms and Conditions, which is part of the Dreamland Billionaire series by Lauren Asher. My review was, did I lose sleep reading this book during the work week? Absolutely. I love this book. It was a romantic and fluffy read where you don't have to think too deeply and can just get carried away with the story. To be honest, I think that's the best description for this book. It follows Declan and Iris. Declan is an heir to a multi-billion-dollar fortune. However, his granddad has stipulated that for him to get access to his fortune, he needs to be married with a child. The issue is Declan has neither a wife nor a child, so he wants to do fake marriages. But everybody that is set up to do this fake marriage, it just doesn't work out until his personal assistant, Iris, offers to step in to be his fake wife. Like I said, it was a book that had me giggling and kicking my feet. Now, as I'm looking at this in terms of what I read, I was on a roll because I then read a 5-star out of 5-star book, and that was The Crimson Moth, or also known as the Heartless Hunter book. This was a really fun book for me to read. It's another fantasy novel, and it follows a young woman called Rune, who is a witch, and she lives in a society where witches become outlawed and exiled, and if you are discovered to be a witch, you will get killed. So she must blend into plain sight and hide her identity. At the same time, she has an affinity to saving other witches, so she becomes a Crimson Moth at night to save these other witches. Unfortunately for her, there is a witch hunter on her case who believes she is the Crimson Moth, so she must hide her identity from this witch hunter whilst also protecting people in the process. So 5-star out of 5-star book. I can't wait for the second one to come out. The next one is This Could Be Us by Kennedy Ryan. I loved this book down bad. 5 stars, and I read it in 2 days. Like I said, beautiful book. It follows our main character, Soledad, who lives her dream life in this gated community. Her man is rich, her kids are wonderful, everything's lovely, they go to private school, and then suddenly her world gets turned upside down when her husband gets arrested for a crime. So now Soledad must figure out how does she make money for her kids so that they can maintain the lifestyle that they're living. Who is she outside of her marriage, outside of having a husband, because she has lost all of this whilst becoming a mother and a wife. And so we go on to this new journey with Soledad as she discovers who she is as a person, outside of being a mother, outside of being a wife, and also as a new love interest enters the picture. We sort of see her journey as she navigates it all. The next book that I read was Icebreaker. I rated it 3 stars out of 5. It's about a young woman called Anastasia who has goals to being on the Olympic figure skating team, and so she's working hard at college to get there. There's an ice hockey team as well. They have their own separate ice rink until it breaks down, and she is forced to share ice rinks with the ice hockey team, and she meets one of the guys on the ice hockey team, and immediately they do not get along, but they are forced to get along because they share ice rinks, and then over time they start to get to know each other. Rated at 3 stars out of 5. My second Ali Hazelwood book that I read was Check and Mate, and I enjoyed it. I gave this 3 stars out of 5. It follows 2 chess stars as they compete against each other to become the best chess master. Legend Born, which is part of a duology. I have read both books in the duology, and it is inspired by the Arthur and Merlin story. And so we follow our main female character, Marie Matthews. She goes to university, and while she's on university, she discovers a secret society, tries to get involved with the secret society because they might have information about her mother and what happened to her mother, and no, without realizing, she gets wrapped up into the secret society that becomes very dangerous very quickly. And book 2 picks up right where book 1 left off, and we sort of see how she discovers her new identity within the secret society and the consequences of all of it. Book 1, I rated that 4 stars out of 5. Book 2, I rated that 3 stars out of 5. As a palate cleanser, I read another memoir, and that was Matthew McConaughey's Green Lights. I listened to this on audiobook, and this was really nice to listen to because Matthew McConaughey narrates it himself. I also thought it was quite fitting because there's a scene in there where he talks about his experience of living in Australia, and he mentions an area that I was living in whilst I was in Australia. So I felt such a connection to him and to his story whilst listening to it, and I was like, whoa, I'm literally in the place you describe it. So Green Lights, Matthew McConaughey, I rated it 4 stars out of 5. After this, I read a classic, a James Baldwin, Giovanni's Room. This is something that I'd been meaning to read for several years now, and I'm glad that I finally got around to reading it. It's based in Paris. Our main character has just moved to Paris and he's trying to work his way around the city, and so he embarks on a journey on his identity, his sexual identity, and trying to find his place within this bustling city. Really beautiful writing by James Baldwin. I would definitely like to read more of his work. This was my introduction to James Baldwin. I could read some more. I did rate it 3 stars out of 5 because I had a struggle trying to get through the book. I'm going to be honest with you, I started it in April, end of April, and I only finished it in July. That's how much of a struggle it was for me to complete this book. After that, I read probably the most complicated book that I could have read in 2024. That is This Is How You Lose a Time War. My mind, even up until now, I'm still trying to put together how this story really went down. There's so many lines I highlighted in this book. Even in my review, I mentioned that it was so poetic. I was confused for 90% of the book, but when it got to the end, I had the aha moment. A reread is necessary as I'll be able to appreciate the writing more now that I know what's happening. And this was beautifully written by 2 authors, which I think added to the element of it being based on red versus blue. So within this world, red and blue are in a time war, they're battling against each other, and they move up and down the timeline in battle with each other. So red wins, blue wins, and they do different things throughout history that will affect the results of the war. And our 2 main characters start to communicate to each other through this timeline, and they discover who each other is and also begin to fall in love, which complicates this whole timeline battle that we're reading about. So now that I understood what was at the end, I feel like if I read this again, I really couldn't get into it. The next book after that was This Summer Will Be Different, which, if I remember correctly, was a book club pick. I rated this 3 stars out of 5. I wrote for my review is a lovely story about Lucy and Felix as well, with romance one summer and their agreement to keep things casual. The only thing is, Felix is Lucy's best friend's younger brother and was told by her best friend not to fall in love with him. Timeline jumps gave me whiplash reading this book, but it was a nice romance story that could have done with better communication between the best friends. I want to visit Prince Edward Island after reading about it. After that, I read Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad. I rated it 4 stars out of 5. I really enjoyed this book. It follows Sonia, who is an actress of Palestinian descent, and she goes back to Palestine for, I think, the summer, and takes up a role within the West Bank's production of Hamlet. And with this, she then explores her family's history with Palestine and also trying to exist in a world today that makes it really difficult to be Palestinian. So it's set on the backdrop of this play, and that really helps to pace the story along, and I quite enjoyed it. I rated it 4 stars out of 5. Then we have Let the Games Begin by Rufaro Faith Mazarura. I rated this 5 stars out of 5. I really enjoyed this. I read this at the time of the Olympics, which was the perfect time to read this story. It's about 2 rising stars. One is an athlete who's competing in the Olympic Games, another is aspiring to work for the Olympic Committee, and so she takes up an internship. 2 of them cross paths in these games at the Olympic Village, and it sparks a whirlwind romance between the 2 of them in a very short time because the Olympics are like 2-3 weeks. Both characters are Zimbabwean. I thought that was phenomenal. The author is Zimbabwean, so it really felt like a homage to my identity and just being Zimbabwean and reading names that you recognise, and reading Shona as well in the book was just so fun to be able to do that. The next book I read was a fantasy novel called Fae Bound. I rated this 4 stars out of 5. So it follows Yuran, who is a warrior within the Elven army, until she makes a fatal mistake and ends up being exiled out into the land beyond where her people live. While she's exiled, she then stumbles across the mythical Fae kingdom. Now she must try to survive in this new world whilst also protecting her sister who has followed her out there and keep her safe. Both of them must confront a complicated history where they've been told one thing but the reality is another thing, and they must decide for themselves Who did they swear alliance to? The next one that I read was Sunny Disposition. I rated it 3 stars out of 5. There's nothing too like stand outish about this book. I just thought it was a nice fun romance read to have over the summer, so that's all I can say about it. My next non-fiction book was When Mackenzie Comes to Town. This is a really interesting book that I listened to as an audiobook. We get to learn in this book the global impact that Mackenzie has had on businesses, institutions, countries and towns, and it's a really massive impact. I think one that's maybe been underplayed when people think about consultancy companies and what they do in the world. And so it was really interesting to see the research that the authors have done to connect what Mackenzie's impact has been with wider communities. After this, I read a really popular BookTok book, which is Quicksilver. I rated it 4 stars out of 5. It was our book club pick, and deservedly so. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I think I finished it in like 2 days because I got so hooked into it. It follows our main protagonist who lives in this poor kingdom, and she decides to cover for her brother, and it gets her sent to the Queen's palace. While she's in the palace, she accidentally unlocks the mythical Fae kingdom and discovers a whole new world. In this new world, she must try to survive, get back to her younger brother who she left back in the human kingdom, and also discover there's a lot of treachery. After this, I read King of Wrath by Ana Huang. I rated this 2 stars. I really struggled to get into it, but it's about a billionaire boyfriend. He basically is blackmailed into marrying this girl by this girl's dad, and the two of them have a really complicated dynamic between the two of them, and thus relationship too. I then read Ravenous Fate, rated that 2 stars out of 5 as well. I feel like I went through a period of not reading great books and they were just very mediocre, so it did slow me down quite a bit. But this is set in a vampire world in Harlem, and this girl must figure out what's happening in her world where vampires are suddenly turning back into humans, and her family might be involved and her ex-best friend is involved, and it's really complicated. So I rated it 2 stars because I did not enjoy the characters and maybe the plot pace, if I remember correctly. Next, I started the Chestnut Spring series with book 1, which was Flawless. I rated this 3 stars out of 5. Book 2 is where I loved it, and I rated it 4 stars out of 5. Each of the book is part of a bigger world where each brother gets his own standalone book, and in this, the brothers each get their own romantic partners, and we see what their story and their journey is, and then we also get nice mentions of each of those characters in all the books as well. So very intertwined world. Each brother has their own personality, very cowboy-esque. I never thought I'd be into cowboy books, but here I am now loving cowboy books, and it matches the fact that I'm currently into country music, so having country music playing in the background whilst reading these books was so fitting for ending my summer. How to End a Love Story. This follows 2 writers who are put into a writer's room together, which should be fine. However, they are basically sworn enemies since high school because our main male character, Grant, accidentally killed our main female character, Helen's younger sister, when they're in high school. So it makes for a very awkward writing room, and they have to work together in order to make this TV show a success. I literally enjoyed this book so much. I rated it 4 stars out of 5, and I could actually reread this again in the future too. Next book I read was Anxious People. It actually took me a while to finish this book because actually I can't tell you why it took me a while. I just couldn't really get into it, but when I did get into it, it picked up so much. I'd say that happened in the last 30% of the book. So the first 70% I was just slogging my way through, but once it got to that last 30%, flying. So Anxious People is about a bank robbery that goes wrong. A group of hostages are now paired together and have to figure out how do they get out of the situation, whilst also finding out that their lives are very much intertwined and they have more similarities than they have as differences. We learn about the bank robbers' motivations. We learn about the police force who is trying to solve this mystery on what happened with this bank robbery. The next one is Reckless, which is book 3 in the Chestnut Spring series. Like I said, I really got into the series, and I rated this book 3 stars out of 5. It follows the third brother, and we see as he meets his romantic match and the story of them unfolds. My next one was my first 5-star read in a long while, and that was Metal Slinger by Rachel Schneider, and this was a really good book. I said I think about this book for a long time. My jaw is on the floor with that ending and the plot twist, and I can't can't wait for another one. And that is so true. Reading this book was just a journey. It follows our main character who lives on the sea, and once a year the people that she belongs to get to go on land to exchange resources, food, all that good stuff. So she finally gets to go on this annual trip, and while she's there a fight breaks out and she is forced to flee, and it sets off a little bit of unrest. Whilst this unrest is happening, this guy follows her back to where her group of people live out on the sea, and twist turns her life upside down, and she must go on this adventure to solve a lot of things that she did not realise needed to be solved, and also figure out her identity in the process. So really love this book. So many twists and turns. The plot twist at the end had my jaw on the floor, and like I said, I still think about it to this day, and I wonder how book 2 is going to unwind. The next one, which was a 4-star book for me, was The Neighbour Favour. Absolutely loved this. Had myself kicking and giggling at my feet. I really enjoyed it. I love a good rom-com, and it follows our main character who is unsatisfied with work, and she decides to write to her favourite author who decides to write back. This starts off a chain of communication between them over the year until she gets ghosted. Later on, she moves into this new flat and finds out her neighbour is the author she was communicating with, but this is not known to her. He recognises her, and the two of them end up working together to try to find a date for her sister's wedding, etc, etc. I loved this story. My next book is a reread, The Fourth Wing. I absolutely loved it when I read it for the first time back in 2023, so the second time it comes to no surprise that I still rate it 5 stars. 5-star book start to finish. Listen to it as an audiobook whilst also reading it myself. My next one is The Spark of the Everflame. I rated this 3 stars out of 5. This is a really good fantasy novel with great world building. We see our main character who has been born and raised to become a healer until her mother goes missing, and so she must go to the royal family to figure out what has happened to her mother. And it's a bit complicated because the royal family are descendants, which gives them extra powers, and they're like sort of special beings, so she must try to survive amongst the royal family whilst also questioning who she is and her identity and secrets that her mother has left behind since her disappearance. The next one that I read was Riftborn. I rated this 4 stars out of 5. This was another really good read as well, and follows a young woman who 20 years after rebellion, it has banded her and her people outcast, but they must live within a society, and she decides to become part of this elusive military group that's there to defend the people. And so she joins in, learns a lot about herself and her powers and what she can do, and discovers that all is not as it seems. So we follow her on this journey. Here's the last 5 books to talk about. Only for the Week by Natasha Bishop. I love this book. I rated it 4 stars out of 5. I will talk you through my review that I said I ate this book up. Rome, the man that you are, no notes. And I don't say this often. I love the journey we went on with our 2 main characters. So much growth for Janelle as she dealt with a really complicated family dynamic and people-pleasing tendencies. The pace of this book was perfect, and the side characters were so lovable, and that's just how I describe it. So it follows Janelle, who has to attend her sister's wedding, which is fine, except the groom is Janelle's ex-boyfriend. So it makes for a very awkward wedding party. And so the wedding party go to Tulum, which is where the destination for the wedding is, a week earlier, and during this week she meets Rome and they have a whirlwind romance. The next one is Tuesday's Memory, which is, I guess you can call it a memoir, but it's my Mitch album. I rated it 3 stars out of 5. It follows Mitch as he reconnects with his old professor who is now terminally ill, and so they meet up every single Tuesday to talk about life lessons, the things that Maury has learned, and reflect on their lives so far. So there's a lot of lessons and things that Maury shares with Mitch through this book. You also get to learn to and feel inspired and reminded that life is for living, and you really have to do those things now. My next book is Glow of the Everflame, which is a sequel to The Spark of the Everflame. It picks up where the last book ended, and we discover that our main female protagonist has powers, and it twists, turns her world upside down and complicates the relationships that she has. My second to last book that I've read is Once Upon a Broken Heart, and I rated it 3 stars out of 5. This book unfortunately fell quite flat for me. It's based on fairy tales, and I think I found that world building of fairy tales not as enjoyable, so I will not be finishing the series off, which is fine. The last book that I've read, which I feel like ties up 2024 in general and something that I know sets me up for 2025 really well, is a book called Failing Forward, Turning Mistakes into Stepping Stones by John C. Maxwell. Highly recommend this book. There's so many things that I was mentally highlighting. I'd love to get a physical version of this book so I can highlight it as well, because I listened to it as an audiobook. The book goes into detail about how most of the times when we make mistakes, we stop there rather than realising that it's an opportunity for us to fail forward and for us to learn from the mistakes that we've made so that we can get in success. A lot of the people that are successful today have found that the best way to succeed is to fail fast, pick yourself up and keep going, and most of the times we're stopping ourselves from living our dream lives because we don't want to try, we don't want to be seen been trying and we don't want to feel like effort has been wasted, but it's a reminder that we should just try nonetheless. So I know we sped up in that last like 15 minutes, but I hope you understand going through 57 books and trying to remember the plots, what's happened, my thoughts on it. It's not an easy task, but we got there in the end. Thank you so much for sticking out to this point in the video. I know it has been a long watch, but it was so nice to reflect on this year's reading. I'm excited to see what happens next year. I will be keeping my reading goal probably at 40, so nothing like going to 60, but really happy that my love for reading has returned, and returned with a bang. We had some bangers of books this year, and I'm excited to see what's in store next year, so make sure you hit the subscribe button. But it's been Nisha, and I'll see you in my next one.